Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. It was supposed to be their dream home, a quaint house at the edge of town, far from the chaos of city life. The Johnson family eagerly moved in, embracing its charm, despite the unusually low price tag. But something felt off, especially about the basement. The first night, as the family unpacked, Mr. Johnson mentioned the previous owner's disappearance to his wife. The realtor said he vanished without a trace, he whispered, glancing nervously at the basement door. It sat at the end of a narrow hallway, its rusted handle untouched for years. Curiosity got the better of them. Over dinner, they asked a neighbor about the house's history. "You mean he didn't tell you?" the old woman replied, her face pale. "Mr. Reynolds lived here. One night, he went into the basement and never came back up. No one found him. That night, the family heard it for the first time, a faint, muffled cry echoing from below. It started as a distant whimper, growing louder as the hours passed. "It's just the pipes," Mr. Johnson reassured his wife, though his voice trembled. But the cries persisted, becoming more anguished with each passing night. Mrs. Johnson couldn't sleep. Their daughter refused to go near the basement door. On the third night, the cries turned to pleas. "Help me," a voice sobbed, chilling them to the bone. Driven by dread and curiosity, Mr. Johnson grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaking stairs. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth. At the far corner, something glimmered in the beam of light, a rusted locket lying atop a patch of disturbed soil. The cries stopped. Silence fell, but it was suffocating, unnatural. Behind him, the basement door creaked shut. The sound of a lock clicking echoed through the stillness. Above, his wife and daughter screamed his name, but all they heard in response was a single, chilling whisper. "Help me." It started on their second night in the house, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to rise from below. At first, the Johnsons thought nothing of it. "Old houses make strange noises," Mr. Johnson muttered as he turned over in bed. But by the third night, the noise was unmistakable. A soft, heart-wrenching cry floated up through the floorboards. It was distant, yet sharp enough to wake them. Mrs. Johnson sat bolt upright. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, clutching her husband's arm. Mr. Johnson reluctantly left the warmth of his bed and tiptoed to the basement door. Pressing his ear against it, he strained to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the wind, nor the groan of settling wood. It was crying, a mournful, human-like wail. "Probably an animal trapped down there," he said, more to convince himself than his wife. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The cries grew louder with each passing night. By the fifth night, they were accompanied by whispers. Soft, pleading words like "help" and "please" seeped through the cracks of the old wooden door. Their daughter, Emily, was the first to act. "It's coming from under the stairs," she whispered one morning, wide-eyed and trembling. She refused to go anywhere near the basement after that. Driven by fear and desperation, Mrs. Johnson placed salt along the basement door frame. "It's supposed to keep spirits out," she said, though her voice quivered with uncertainty. The cries paused that night, replaced by an eerie silence. But by dawn, the whispers returned, angrier now, louder. The voice seemed to follow them throughout the house. "You can't ignore me," it hissed, its words echoing even in the empty rooms. That night, as the family huddled in their living room, the basement door rattled violently. A single, blood-curdling scream pierced the air, sending chills down their spines. It stopped just as suddenly as it began. The silence that followed was deafening, but they knew one thing. Whatever was in the basement wanted out. The cries had become unbearable. Each night, they grew louder, more anguished. Mrs. Johnson begged her husband to call someone, anyone, but his pride got the better of him. "It's just an animal," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll take care of it." The air grew colder as he descended the creaking wooden stairs. Shadows danced on the basement walls, their shapes twisting and stretching unnaturally in the dim light. His flashlight flickered, but he pressed on, determined to find the source of the noise. Halfway down, the crying stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it left his ears ringing. A shiver ran down his spine as he reached the bottom step. The basement was eerily empty, the only sounds coming from the hum of the furnace and his own shallow breathing. As he scanned the room, his flashlight caught something strange. Along the far wall, jagged scratches marred the brickwork, as though something, or someone, had clawed desperately to escape. The sight made his stomach turn. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping closer. That's when he saw it. A small, locked compartment embedded in the wall. The padlock was rusted, the wood around it splintered, as though it had been violently attacked. A faint sound began to emanate from behind the door, a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like fingernails on wood. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock, before finally gripping it. The cries returned, this time louder and more anguished than ever. They filled the room, echoing off the walls, drowning out his panicked breathing. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, its beam casting wild shadows as it rolled across the floor. From behind the compartment, a whisper cut through the chaos. "Let me out," it pleaded, the voice drenched in sorrow. Paralyzed by fear, Mr. Johnson could only stare as the padlock began to rattle violently, the cries turning into guttural screams. And then, the basement door slammed shut behind him. The truth was darker than any of them could have imagined. For days, the basement's cries echoed through the house, the whispers growing into desperate pleas. Mrs. Johnson could no longer bear it. "We have to do something," she said, her voice shaking with fear. Mr. Johnson, reluctant but driven by an overwhelming need to end the torment, gathered his courage and returned to the basement. This time, he brought the key to the locked compartment, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as though something was watching him from the shadows. As he unlocked the compartment, a chilling wind rushed out, cold enough to freeze his very bones. He stepped back, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and shone it inside. What he found made his blood run cold. A set of old, yellowed papers scattered on the floor, and an old journal that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Opening the journal, Mr. Johnson's eyes widened in horror. The words were scrawled in frantic handwriting. The ritual failed. "He's still here. I can't send him back. The cries won't stop until I let him out." The entry ended abruptly. "Let him out?" Mrs. Johnson's voice came from behind him, causing him to spin around. She had followed him down the stairs. His mind raced as he pieced it together. The previous owner, Mr. Reynolds, had been trying to summon his late wife. A failed attempt that had unleashed something far darker than he had ever anticipated. The cries from the basement weren't just of sorrow. They were the cries of an entity, trapped, angry, and desperate to be freed. Suddenly, the cries stopped. The silence was deafening, but something far worse was coming. The shadows in the basement began to move, twisting unnaturally toward them. A voice, cold and ancient, whispered from the dark corner, "You let me out now." The temperature dropped, frost forming on the walls. The family turned, but before they could flee, the basement door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The cries, now replaced by guttural growls, grew louder, surrounding them. And in that moment, they realized the entity hadn't just been waiting to be freed. It was waiting for its next victim. When the Harris family moved into their new home, they were full of excitement. The house was spacious, the neighborhood quiet, perfect for starting fresh. But there was something unsettling about the basement. A thick, musty draft seemed to seep from the walls, making the space feel colder than it should, even during summer months. At first, Mr. Harris chalked it up to poor insulation. The house was old after all, but as the days went by, the draft grew stronger, and strange sounds, creaking floorboards, faint footsteps, echoed up through the basement, especially at night. Determined to fix the issue, Mr. Harris decided to begin renovations. Armed with tools, he started tearing down the old wallpaper and peeling up the floorboards. That's when he saw it, a bricked-up doorway, hidden behind layers of plaster and debris, as though someone had deliberately sealed it off long ago. Curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed a sledgehammer and started chipping away at the bricks, each thud of the hammer reverberating through the silent basement. The work was grueling, but after what seemed like hours, the last brick finally gave way. As the wall crumbled, an overwhelming chill rushed out from the darkness beyond. Mr. Harris froze. The air felt wrong. There was something off about the space behind the wall, something that had been sealed for far too long. He took a step back, heart pounding in his chest, but the curiosity was too much. He needed to see what lay beyond. What he found was nothing short of horrifying. The narrow, dark corridor stretched on endlessly, far deeper than the basement itself should have allowed. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, and the air was thick with decay. At the very end, a faint light flickered, as though from a distant room. Mr. Harris stepped forward, his mind racing. "What is this?" he whispered to himself, unable to look away from the beckoning light. But as he took another step, the ground beneath him groaned, shifting beneath his feet. The basement door slammed shut, locking itself with a force that rattled the house. He was trapped. Suddenly, the light grew brighter, and from the darkness behind the bricked-up corridor, a voice whispered, "You've opened it." The basement, it seemed, was just the beginning. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow staircase that seemed to descend into an abyss of shadows. The flickering light from Mr. Harris's flashlight barely illuminated the first few steps. As he hesitated at the threshold, a gust of cold air blew up from below, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something darker, something ancient. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had to go down. Maybe it was the unsettling whispers from the darkness, or the strange pull that seemed to draw him forward. But the need to understand what was hidden beneath his new home consumed him. With a trembling hand, he took the first step. The moment his foot touched the ground, the stairs groaned beneath him, the walls closing in as though the house itself was watching him. The further he descended, the colder it became, until his breath came in visible puffs of vapor. Each step seemed to stretch, the staircase growing longer, the shadows darker. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Harris reached the bottom, and that's when the true horror began. The staircase ended abruptly in a dimly lit corridor, but before him lay an impossible sight. A vast, winding labyrinth stretched endlessly, its walls shifting in and out of focus. One moment, they were straight and firm. The next, they seemed to twist at impossible angles. The floor beneath him rippled like water, making him feel as though he was walking on something not quite solid. He took a step forward, and immediately the path before him distorted. The hallway that had once seemed straight now curved sharply to the left, as if mocking his every move. The faint light from the corridor flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. With each step, time began to lose its meaning. What felt like hours passed in an instant, while only minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. Mr. Harris looked back, but the staircase had vanished. The door he had come through was nowhere to be found. All that remained was the labyrinth, the endless maze of shifting walls and distorted paths. Then, a voice echoed from the darkness, soft at first, then growing louder. "You cannot escape. This place will keep you forever." The realization hit him like a cold wave. The labyrinth wasn't a passage, it was a prison, and he was its newest inhabitant. The maze seemed endless, and with each turn, the walls began to pulse as if alive, breathing. Mr. Harris stumbled through the shifting corridors, panic clawing at his chest. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the house was holding him captive in its very bones. With each step, he grew more disoriented, time slipping away, the floor beneath him rippling like water. It was then that the visions began. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting shadow at the corner of his eye, a whisper that barely reached his ears. But soon, they were unmistakable. The first vision hit him like a punch to the gut. He entered a small room, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper. A family sat around a dining table, smiling, laughing, alive. But the moment their eyes met his, their faces twisted into masks of terror. Their smiles froze, and a faint, eerie voice echoed through the room. Barely a whisper. "Get out. You don't belong here." Mr. Harris turned, desperate to leave, but the walls had closed in on him. The hallway stretched into the distance, but there was no way out. And as he took another step, the vision returned. This time, the room was different. The family was gone, replaced by a man, pale, gaunt, and trembling, his eyes wide with fear. His mouth moved in silent desperation, and then the voice returned, but louder now, more forceful. They couldn't leave. "Neither will you." Mr. Harris stumbled backward, breath ragged, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the visions didn't stop. Each turn brought new horrors, twisted images of the past occupants of the house, all of them warning him with desperate cries, their faces contorted in agony. The warnings grew louder, more insistent. "Never go further. You can never escape." Desperation clawed at him, but he couldn't stop. Each vision was a trap, luring him deeper into the maze. The walls seemed to shift around him, disorienting him further as he tried to make sense of the nightmarish journey. Finally, as he reached what seemed to be the heart of the labyrinth, a final vision manifested before him. The man, the last occupant, stared at him with eyes full of sorrow. "I tried to warn you," he whispered. "There's no way out. This house doesn't let go." The walls closed in. The whispers grew deafening, and Mr. Harris realized he was no longer a visitor. He had become part of the house. The further Mr. Harris ventured, the more the house seemed to shift around him. His sense of time and space had fractured. Each step felt heavier, the air denser, as if the very foundation of the house was pulling him deeper into its core. The labyrinth was no longer just a series of twisting hallways. It was something far worse, something alive. The walls pulsated as he moved, the floor groaning beneath his feet, as though the house was breathing in time with him. The faint whispers of the past, the warnings, the cries, had become a constant, relentless hum, echoing in his mind. But then, the path ahead twisted in on itself, a sharp turn that led to an open space. At first, it appeared to be a small, dimly lit room, but as Mr. Harris entered, he realized something was horribly wrong. The walls, once solid, seemed to stretch and ripple like fabric. The light flickered again, only this time, it cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. And in the center of the room, a massive, swirling vortex hovered in the air, its edges flickering like flames. A sense of foreboding filled his chest, his pulse racing as the truth hit him like a hammer. The basement wasn't just a room. It wasn't just a part of the house. It was a portal, a gateway, a voice, cold and empty, seemed to come from the vortex, its tone ancient and echoing. You've crossed the threshold. You cannot leave. Frozen in place, Mr. Harris watched in horror as shadows began to take form. Figures twisted and contorted, their faces distorted by pain and terror. He recognized them now, the past occupants, the ones he had seen in his visions. They were no longer just ghostly apparitions. They were trapped, bound to the house, doomed to wander the labyrinth for eternity. And they were staring at him, their hollow eyes filled with a warning he was too late to heed. The portal swirled violently, and in an instant, the ground beneath him crumbled. He fell, tumbling into the vortex with a scream that was swallowed by the darkness. When he awoke, he found himself at the beginning of the staircase once more, the same draft blowing up from the basement, the same cold, suffocating air. He stumbled to his feet, disoriented, but as he tried to flee, the door slammed shut. The cycle had begun again. The basement had claimed him, and now he was part of its eternal trap. It started with the scratching. At first, the family thought it was nothing more than rodents nesting under the stairs. The faint tapping and rustling noises echoed from beneath the floorboards late at night, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. Mr. and Mrs. Davis dismissed it as harmless, just a rodent infestation that could be easily dealt with. But over time, the sounds grew stranger, more distinct. One night, as Mr. Davis sat in the living room reading, he heard it again, a faint tapping like nails on wood. He glanced toward the stairs, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He was about to return to his book when he heard something that froze him in place. A whisper, soft and distant, coming from beneath the stairs. He leaned closer, straining to hear. "Help me." His blood ran cold. It wasn't a rat. It was a voice, a human voice. Mrs. Davis, hearing his sharp intake of breath, came into the room. "What is it?" she asked. "I heard something. It came from under the stairs," he said, his voice shaking. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, but when she heard the voice again the next night, it was undeniable. This was no rodent. It was something or someone alive beneath the house. The whispers grew louder each day, more frantic. Then came the tapping, louder and more deliberate. Mrs. Davis, unable to ignore it any longer, suggested they investigate. They knelt by the stairs, peering down into the dark, unlit space beneath. But there was nothing there, just the same shadows they had seen every day. It was then that the whispers stopped. A heavy silence filled the room, and they could feel the air growing colder around them. And then, without warning, the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, you have to help me." This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a pleading scream, raw and desperate. The floor beneath the stairs creaked ominously, and Mr. Davis, shaking with dread, made a decision. He tore up the wooden panels and pried open the hidden space beneath the stairs. What he found was not the source of the noises, but something far worse. The walls were covered in deep gouges, long scratches, like someone had tried desperately to escape. And in the center of the small space, there was an old, cracked mirror. A mirror that reflected nothing but darkness, and the faint outline of a figure staring back at them. Before Mr. Davis could react, the voice spoke once more, now loud and unmistakably real. "Get out. I'm not alone anymore." The mirror cracked, sending shards flying across the room, and the family was swallowed by the silence once again. But now, something far more terrifying lingered in the air, a promise that the voices from beneath the stairs were just the beginning of something much darker. The whispers continued every night, growing louder, more insistent. Mr. and Mrs. Davis had long since abandoned the idea of ignoring the noises. Whatever was happening beneath the stairs was no longer something they could brush aside. One evening, after weeks of listening to the eerie voices, Mr. Davis decided to investigate further. Armed with a flashlight and his nerve barely intact, he pried apart the wooden panels beneath the stairs. He had hoped to find nothing more than an old storage space, or perhaps a few forgotten items. But what he uncovered was far more sinister. Behind the panels was a hidden compartment, deep and narrow, its edges concealed by the crumbling wood. As Mr. Davis carefully cleared away the dust and debris, a chill swept through the air, as if something cold was pressing in on him from all sides. His hand trembled as he reached inside, pulling out a small wooden chest, its surface marked with scratches and dents, as though it had been tossed about. His heart raced. This was it, the source of the strange happenings. He opened the chest, and the contents sent a cold shiver down his spine. Inside, there were old belongings, a faded scarf, a rusted key, and at the bottom, a small, worn diary. Mrs. Davis, who had been standing anxiously by the doorway, joined him at once. Together, they flipped open the diary, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was frantic, jagged, like it had been written in a hurry. The first entry was simple. I don't know how long I've been here. The whispers are constant now. I can hear them through the walls. But as they read on, the entries grew darker, filled with dread and horror. One entry stood out. I saw it again. The shadow beneath the stairs. It watches me. It speaks, but it's not human. It wants something, but I don't know what. It says if I leave, I'll never escape. It says it will take me when I'm not looking. With each word, the air in the room grew colder, the whispers louder, until they were practically screaming in Mr. Davis's ears. The final entry was the most chilling of all. The thing is waiting. I've tried to escape, but it follows me everywhere. It lives under the stairs, and it will never let me go. The room suddenly fell silent. The hairs on the back of Mr. Davis's neck stood on end, and his hands shook violently as he closed the diary. But before he could say anything, a loud thud echoed from beneath the stairs, followed by a low, rasping breath. The whispers resumed, now clear and unmistakable. You should have left it alone. And then a sound much worse, a slow scraping like nails on the floor, coming from right under their feet. The figure from the diary, the thing under the stairs, was coming. After discovering the hidden compartment beneath the stairs, the Davis family thought they had uncovered the source of the strange happenings. But they were wrong. What followed was the beginning of something far more terrifying than they could have imagined. That night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were no longer confined to the darkness beneath the stairs. They seemed to echo from every corner of the house. Mr. Davis sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest, listening to the voices. They had gone from soft whispers to guttural growls, like something inhuman was speaking directly into his mind. Then, the shadows began to move. At first, it was a subtle shift, an unnatural darkness at the edge of the hallway, or a corner of the living room that seemed just a little too dark. But soon, the shadows became more distinct, taking form as they slithered along the walls. They darted across the rooms, moving with a purpose, as if searching for something or someone. Mr. Davis rushed to the living room, but it was too late. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the floor like black tendrils. The furniture shifted, an armchair dragging across the floor as though it had a mind of its own. "Lisa!" Mr. Davis shouted, but his voice caught in his throat. Mrs. Davis, standing at the doorway, watched in horror as a tall, dark shape rose from the corner of the room. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, a person-shaped mass of darkness, its eyes too glowing pinpricks of malice. The temperature in the room plummeted. and the whispers evolved into harsh, guttural screams. "Get out! You've disturbed it!" The screams tore through the house, bouncing off the walls, deafening in their intensity. The figure in the corner twisted, its shape contorting into grotesque forms before vanishing into the darkness. In that moment, the house itself seemed to come alive. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, pressing down on them from all sides. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows rattled in their frames, and the floor beneath their feet groaned, as though the house was shifting. Terrified, Mrs. Davis reached for the phone, but as her hand brushed against it, the receiver was wrenched from her grasp and flew across the room, slamming against the wall. The whispers returned, now loud and clear, mixed with eerie laughter and desperate, tortured cries. The sounds were coming from beneath the stairs, but they were no longer the only source of terror. The house was alive, and it was trying to consume them. The final scream echoed throughout the house, followed by a sudden silence, so thick it felt suffocating. The shadows no longer moved, they waited. The whispers had stopped, but the terror lingered, as though the house itself was watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. And then, the unmistakable sound of something scratching beneath the stairs, the nails of something trying to claw its way to freedom. The Davis family could no longer deny it. The house was haunted, and it wasn't just the whispers or the shadows. It was something darker, something far more evil that had been lurking in the corners of their home. The moment they uncovered the hidden compartment beneath the stairs, the entity that had been trapped there seemed to stir, feeding off the fear that had begun to permeate the house. It was then that the true nature of the presence made itself known. The whispers were no longer soft murmurs. They had evolved into a guttural, malevolent growl that seemed to reverberate from the very walls. The air grew cold, biting, as if the house itself was exhaling a frigid breath, filling every room with dread. The shadows that once crept across the floor now formed dark shapes, figures twisted and unnatural, looming at the edges of every room, watching, waiting. Mrs. Davis, who had spent the past few weeks hoping the strange occurrences would stop, was the first to realize the terrifying truth. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was alive, and it had fed off their fear, growing stronger with every night that passed. The longer they stayed, the more it tormented them. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard the unmistakable sound of scratching beneath the floorboards, long, deliberate, and desperate. It was the same sound she had heard the first night they moved in, but now, it was accompanied by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You can never leave." She sat up in terror, clutching the blankets around her. The voice was close, too close. She could feel its breath on her skin, cold and suffocating. She glanced at Mr. Davis, but he was frozen in place, his eyes wide with fear. The scratching intensified, as if something was clawing its way out from beneath the stairs. The walls trembled, and the temperature plummeted further. The darkness seemed to press in, thick and suffocating, wrapping around them like a vice. Then, the voice came again, clearer this time, its tone full of malice. "I am bound to this place, and so are you." The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The entity wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was a malevolent force, bound to the house by some ancient curse, feeding off their fear and tormenting anyone who dared to live there. It was as though the house itself was alive, a prison for the entity that had been trapped for generations. And now, the Davis family was its next victims, bound by the same curse that had ensnared so many before them. Desperate to escape, they rushed to the front door, but the moment they touched the handle, the entire house seemed to shift. The floor beneath their feet groaned, the walls closed in, and the door refused to budge. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams of torment, as if the house itself was crying out in pain. The evil presence had them now. There would be no escape. They were trapped, bound to the house for eternity, feeding the entity's hunger for fear, just as those before them had done. And so, the cycle continued.